Hi guys, I'm Elizma Lambrt, and today we're going to talk about organic acid testing, and we're going to actually take a test and deconstruct it bit by bit so that you guys can see what it measures for and why it may be useful for you, depending on what you may be dealing with in your health journey at this point in time. So we've spoken previously about organic acid testing, or the organic acid test, as being a little bit of a snapshot of your biochemistry at that point in time, and it gives you good insight into what's happening with your metabolism and other areas of your health. So we're going to deconstruct an organic acid test, and I've chosen this one because it's a really good example of a whole lot of things that's going on for this person. And you'll see that on this page specifically, we are measuring for intestinal, bacterial, and fungal markers. And so you can see on this test that there is a marker called arabinose that is sitting quite elevated. And this is usually an indication of fungal overgrowth. And fungal organisms, such as Candida albicans, for instance, which is pretty common, can produce metabolites such as arabinose, which you can measure in the urine, which is what this test is. Now, there are some foods and some supplements that you do need to avoid about 48 hours before you take a sample to perform this test and to get the results, because these can sometimes falsely elevate some of the metabolites, such as arabinose, on this test and give you false positives. Now, some of those foods and herbs are things like apples, grapes, which includes raisins, pears, cranberries, arabinogalactin, which is a type of a fiber supplement, echinacea, reishi mushrooms, and ribose. So check your supplements before you take a sample and send it into the lab. Now, fungal overgrowth, some of you may be familiar with things like Candida albicans. It's actually a pretty common fungal overgrowth that occurs post-antibiotic use. It can happen with people who are immunocompromised. That essentially means their immune system is suppressed, and that can be due to chronic stress or other factors, nutritional factors. So it's pretty common to sometimes get Candida overgrowth if any of those things kind of occur for you. And when you do get Candida overgrowth, you can become a bit more susceptible for conditions such as SIFO, which is just short for small intestinal fungal overgrowth, when Candida organisms are allowed to grow in higher amounts than they need to in the higher part of the digestive tract. And usually people who have quite severe fungal overgrowth, they experience symptoms such as brain fog, fatigue. They often have sinus and hay fever symptoms, skin rashes. Sometimes they can have constipation, food intolerances, dry skin or dry scalp, and they often have a very white coated tongue as well. So if this sounds familiar, it may be something that you may want to check for. And then we also have bacterial markers on there. In this particular example, all the bacterial markers were normal, but bacteria is a common occurrence in a lot of people with a condition called SIBO, very similar to SIFO. SIBO is pretty much the same, except it stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and that can also cause a lot of food intolerances and food reactions and gut symptoms in people who have bacteria in their small intestine. Of course, on this specific test, we don't know if bacteria are growing in the upper part of the digestive tract or in the lower part, but either way, it can cause a lot of problems for a lot of people. There's also a subsection there called Clostridia, the Clostridium markers. Again, in this sample, it was pretty normal. Clostridia is another organism that can be problematic in a lot of people. Even though it's a commensal organism and we do need it for certain functions in the body, when it becomes overgrown, it can cause a lot of issues, especially in the dopaminergic system in the brain. So essentially, with bacteria and with Clostridia markers, we really want to kind of see how it affects the rest of the system, and this may depend on the type of bacteria that you have. Unfortunately, this test doesn't actually diagnose or specify what type of bacteria. It can just give you an indication of what bacteria it may be. But a lot of these bacterial organisms can interfere with a hyperpituitary adrenal axis, which can then give rise to things like stress intolerance and sleeping issues and things like that. And it can affect that dopaminergic and GABAergic systems as well, which is very commonly involved in mood disorders, trouble with concentration and thinking and things like that. So this is truly where you can see where the gut connection is with a lot of neurological or brain symptoms, because we know that the gut is intrinsically linked with the neurological system and the brain. So this is just one way that we can test for that connection between the gut and the brain, and certainly a very valuable test to do if you want to kind of see what's going on in your gut. So it's very important to understand that connection between our gut and our brain, because a lot of the stuff actually starts from our neurological system. And I'm going to explain to you how that works. So most of our issues often starts with chronic stress. Because when you have chronic stress, then that kind of like disrupts the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is an integral part of our digestion. We need that autonomic nervous system to help with stomach acid and bile acid release. So stomach acid is your hydrochloric acid, and then you have your bile acids from the gallbladder, and you need those two compounds as part of digestion to help and kill off all the acid-sensitive bacteria as well as the alkaline-sensitive bacteria. Now, if that doesn't happen, you end up with gut dysbiosis. And when you end up with gut dysbiosis, as you know, then that gives rise to conditions such as leaky gut syndrome, food intolerances, poor absorption of nutrients, poor detoxification, all of those kinds of things. And so now that could potentially put more pressure on your phase 2 liver detoxification mechanism. Now, if that's not working so well, or it's a bit more sluggish than it needs to be, then that can eventually lead to an increased toxic burden. And when you have an increased toxic burden, that in itself can feed back into the whole gut dysbiosis, which then goes back and affects the brain and the neurological function, and we have the whole cycle starting all over again. And that is why it is so important to look at all of these aspects and to make sure that everything as they flow on is as healthy as possible for you. So then we have a section in the organic acid test called the oxalate section. And some of you may be familiar with the word oxalates, but probably more in the context of kidney stones, because that is oxalate calcium crystals. That's essentially what kidney stones are. But oxalates is also a little bit more than just that. It's actually a natural compound that we can get in some foods. It's especially high in spinach, but we also can find it in a lot of nut products and soy products as well. And there also are some very healthy vegetables that we can find it. But generally how it's designed in nature is that we don't really absorb it. We generally just excrete these oxalates out of the body. There are a few occasions, though, where we may increase or have increased absorption of these oxalates, and that usually occurs due to either a lack of bile or maybe not enough bacterial species in the gut that actually have certain enzymes that can help and break down these oxalate crystals. So there are reasons why we may have higher absorption of oxalates than we should have. There are also some organism species like bacteria and parasites and fungal organisms and mold that can also increase the oxalate load in the body as well. So we see actually quite a lot of that in some of this organic acid testing, and a very important marker to look for. Because why are oxalates important? Well, one of the key reasons why it is so important is because it's a very potent mineral binder. So it can bind to minerals such as magnesium and zinc and calcium and iron and all of those minerals that we need for so many biochemical reactions in the body. Because we know that we need minerals for our thyroid gland, for the thyroid to function properly and make thyroid hormones, for metabolism. We need minerals for adrenal function, which is how we produce energy. We need minerals for our brain chemical production, which is what helps and balance our mood. We need minerals for hormone detoxification, which helps us with, hormone dominance problems, but also for hormone production as well, to help us with deficiencies in things like estrogen and testosterone. So you can imagine if you have something like oxalates in your system, which are binding up all these minerals and making them unavailable, to the body, because we can't use them when they're bound up, then you are going to end up with issues in a lot of other systemic areas, purely just because you're not able to use the minerals that you are getting from your supplements and from your diet. Now, some of my favorite markers on the organic acid test is the energy markers, because this is where we look for energy patterns. So the markers here that you can see here, they're essentially part of cellular biochemistry, which is involved in the mitochondria. Now, for you guys who don't know, the mitochondria are these small little organelles that essentially act as powerhouses in our cells by taking the food that we eat and then turning it into like a chemical energy, which then gets stored into a small molecule called ATP, similar to our name, ATP Science. And this ATP is what makes all our cells function. Our kidney cells, our liver cells to help with detoxification, our brain cells to help with mood regulation, our pancreatic cells to help with blood sugar balance. All of our cells need this ATP to function. Without this ATP, all our cellular functions in the body goes down, which means that our organs and our tissues cannot do the jobs that they are designed to do as well as they need to. So we're looking at suboptimal health here. Now, how much ATP you make will depend on your diet, so all the cofactors and substrates that you get in through your diet. It will depend whether you become deficient in certain nutrients or even whether your cells think that they may actually have to tone down energy production and do something else instead. This is something we sometimes call the cell danger response. When cells detect some kind of a danger in the body or that something is not right, and then it starts to prioritize whether it's going to make energy or whether it's going to go more in a defensive mode. Now, what this also can sometimes tell us, these energy patterns, is whether you're a sugar burner or whether you're a fat burner. Possibly how well fat adapted you may be. It can also sometimes tell us things about things like gluconeogenesis. In this particular pattern, we can see that with this person, they have markers of mold and candida overgrowth, which we already know they do have. And we can also see that they have markers of a process called gluconeogenesis, where we can sometimes break down proteins or our muscles to turn it into glucose to help and get more glucose into the bloodstream to help regulate blood sugar levels. So with this person, we can see some of these patterns. So when we see disrupted energy patterns, we always have to ask why. So this can sometimes be to do with whether infections may be influencing your energy pathways. It can also sometimes be environmental toxins or metals that can influence energy pathways. And it can sometimes be as simple as nutritional deficiencies that can influence energy pathways. And this is where it becomes good to work with someone who really understands how to interpret these tests, who can kind of like figure out for you what could be disrupting your energy pathways, which may then affect your ability to use fat or sugar as energy molecules, and then also for your organs to function properly. And then we have the neurotransmitter markers. Essentially, they're more like neurotransmitter metabolites. They're not actually neurotransmitters. You can certainly measure for neurotransmitters, but what we see here are more the metabolic products for when we break down neurotransmitters, and we then excrete these products into our urine, and we can get like a rough assessment of roughly how much neurotransmitters we may be making, or even how well we are breaking it down, which has got a lot to do with genetic expression of certain genes, which is a whole another topic for another day. But neurotransmitters, as we know, are brain chemicals that's affecting a lot of what goes in our brain and our nervous system, such as how we feel, how well we focus and concentrate, how well our sleep patterns may be, how well do we sleep, how much energy we may have, how well we could potentially regulate our blood pressure, because neurotransmitters have a lot of functions both in the gut and in the brain. So on this test, you can see that we measure for dopamine metabolites, norepinephrine and epinephrine metabolites, and also serotonin metabolites, which can provide us a lot of information around how well you are producing these brain chemicals and how you are breaking them down. And so these are the folate metabolism markers. Now, some of you may have heard of the gene called MTHFR, which stands for methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. And some of you may have even had yourself tested to see if you may have a polymorphism, which is a genetic mutation on your MTHFR gene. So for those of you who have had yourself tested, maybe you've got the MTHFR C677T variety or the MTHFR A1298C variety. And you kind of wonder, okay, well, what does this mean for me? We also have to kind of remember that genes are usually either turned on or off. And for them to be expressed, they have to be turned on. So you may have a gene mutation on there, but is it actually being expressed? Well, By measuring folate markers such as the uracil and the thiamine that we see here on the organic acid test, it can actually give us great information into the function of the whole folate pathway and also of the MTHFR gene itself, to kind of give us an idea of whether we have a dirty folate pathway or a dirty MTHFR gene. It can also give us potential information on other folate gene expression as well, such as your TYMS gene, MTHFR, as already mentioned, MTHFD, and DHFR genes, amongst others. So it's a great way to kind of see whether you may need more activated forms of folate or whether that pathway is working the way it needs to. The fat metabolism markers are also a very interesting bunch of markers. And again, it can help us to determine how well we're potentially metabolizing fat, depending on, your diet and case history and all of that. And also, more importantly, how well you are able to use these fats as energy molecules, because we actually can get a lot more energy from fats than we get from glucose if our body knows how to use it. So it can give us an insight of how potentially fat adapted you may be. So to give you kind of an idea, with glucose or sugar, we get about 2 ATP molecules or 2 energy molecules for every sugar molecule that we burn. Now with fat molecules, we get around about 36 ATP molecules for every fat molecule that we burn. That will of course depend on the length of the carbon chain of the fatty acid, but that's a rough estimate. So you can see from 2 energy molecules to 36 energy molecules, there's a very, very big difference. So these markers, the fat metabolism markers, can give us an idea whether you are breaking down fats and whether you're actually transporting it into the cells, into the mitochondria, where it can be burned for energy or turned into ketones. And we have to remember that ketones, for you guys who know a lot about ketones are a very, very valuable energy source for the brain and for the rest of the body. So we don't want to be wasting ketones. We don't want to be just losing them through the urine. We want to see how well our body is able to use these ketones for energy. So these markers give us a lot of insight into that part of our biochemistry and metabolism. We also have a nutritional panel on the organic acid test, because all of these nutrients have to be metabolized and broken down in the body, and they do kind of like leave behind what we call a metabolic trail, and this is what we're kind of measuring in the urine. So there are quite a few nutrients on this panel. You'll see a lot of B vitamins, CoQ10, biotin is another one there. And so it can give us a bit of an idea of the status of a lot of the nutrients that we need for a lot of our other biochemical reactions to work really well. So this is a detoxification panel. And a detoxification panel is actually really important in today's times, modern living, where we are constantly exposed to toxins in our environment, through our diet, through our workplaces, and even from the organisms that may reside in our bodies. A lot of the gut organisms that may overgrow can produce toxins in themselves, such as ammonia and gliotoxins and things like that our bodies have to get rid of. And usually these detoxification mechanisms work really well. And that includes things like your liver, your kidney, your lymphatic system. These are all part of our detoxification systems. Now, usually, if we are not detoxifying these metabolites or other things out of the system that should not be there and that's interfering with our biochemistry, we can experience symptoms such as brain fog, fatigue, skin rashes, food intolerances, thinking even things like irritability, and a lot of mood disorders as well. So it can be a wide variety of symptoms that can be experienced with poor detoxification. Now, in this specific panel that you see here, we can see that this person has a bit of a stressed phase 2 liver glutathione detoxification pathway. So there's 5 pathways in the liver, generally with a detoxification, and this one measures the glutathione pathway. And glutathione is a very, very important antioxidant that our bodies produce to help us get rid of metals that we are exposed to in our food chain and in our environment. It helps us to get rid of things like microplastics and xenoestrogens. That can cause a lot of hormonal disruption. It's also needed to get rid of other man-made chemicals such as PCBs and plastics and things like that. Like I said, gliotoxins and a lot of bacterial metabolites as well, also from fungal and mold. And also hydrogen peroxide. Now, hydrogen peroxide is a big one because glutathione is the main molecule that gets rid of hydrogen peroxide. And as the name suggests, hydrogen peroxide is essentially what makes us grow grey very early. So glutathione is an essential nutrient that our bodies make to help and slow down the aging process. It helps and slows down the rate at which our hair goes grey and our skin starts to deteriorate. And so if this system is overworked, then it can start affecting other things in our health, such as how well we age. So we do want to kind of always make sure that these pathways are well supported. And this is a test that can show you whether those pathways need a little bit more support to help them function properly. So that concludes our deconstruction of the organic acid test. I hope you really enjoyed it. Pretty much in summary, these are just some of the biochemical reactions that we can measure inside the body at any point in time. There's many other pathology tests out there as well, which can give you great insight into what's going on for your health. There are even some DNA tests that complements the organic acid test really, really well when we want to kind of start to measure genetic expression and go that little bit deeper. And so the final step would be for you to find someone who knows how to interpret these tests accurately and can put you on a road forward so that you can experience the best health that you can be.